program appears each Wednesday morning, 8:15 to 9. Very guest this morning. We have an interesting young man. Well, he's a young guy, isn't he?
Younger than we are.
Author, neighbor, former professor, Paul Beaver, farmer, raconteur. Anything else you want to add to that?
On and on and on.
We're talking about the Scully family today, and T.A. Scully, the one with whom we are familiar, Tom Scully, he had a brother, Frederick. Mm-hmm. And is that where, was he the owner of the Nebraska land?
Yes,
is that how that shook out?
Yes, because William, after there's a key point here we need to make, that when he came back to America, he's put ads in newspapers all over Germany telling people, the Germans, who still were having trouble getting to democracy in their country in the 1870s, and as you know, really didn't get one till after World War I, to come to America. He would have the land for them. You come over here, I'll get you the land. You don't have to pay a thing for the land. You farm it for me. However, if you want to build a house and a barn, that's yours, and you will pay the taxes on the land. Lawyers, when I give this talk, will just go crazy. They say they can't do that. Well, they have.
They did.
For 150 years.
Yeah.
But, and German families came. And all of us know a bunch of them. I mean, Herman Wibben, Glockengays, Ubengays,
sure.
All that group, all their families. Johann Schultz, my great-grandfather, came. And he gave them 80 or 160 just west of there.
Think of that.
Said, that's yours to do. You farm it. Here are the rules. You will have a crop rotation, which nobody had ever heard of up that time. You have to have a fourth of your land in legumes. It's your land. You build your house. You build your barn. You do whatever. And also, I collect $1.25 up to $2 an acre cash rent before you start. But they came because he knew that they would not give him a problem. They were industrious farmers. They didn't care about politics. They just wanted to farm, and they were great farmers. And then he said to them, when you're not farming, I'll hire a good many of you, and we'll dig the ditches to drain your land. So it was a win-win deal. You're going to get your farmland drained to make it more profitable. John Deere had invented the steel plow by then, which would turn this prairie grass over.
What they called a moldboard plow.
Moldboard plow, which was steel. Because iron wouldn't scour. Lincoln used to always use that metaphor about that argument won't scour. It won't work because iron, was steel a lot of times. I remember my father saying bad words cleaning the steel plows off. Because it's clay. But it was a win-win thing. He brought them in. They farmed. They had a rotation. They had a set of rules, which they didn't care. That they were there to farm. They weren't there for politics and just to farm. They drained the land. That's what they did for the next. They made this into a virtual Garden of Eden because that rich land. Then they could farm, and that went on. Then he bought. That's when he bought all this land, and of course his second wife had the family then. That's the Frederick you're talking about. And Thomas, who was here, that's Peter and Michael's dad. And then they had a daughter. She had a daughter, and that's part of the family in some ways. I'm not 100% sure how that was. And then the one son died. So you had these two boys. He still ruled the roost. Peter told a great story about his grandfather down at Elkhart. He said that his father, that's Thomas, was telling about his dad. And he said, my father that's William, the original, was complaining one day that he had to go from, how do they say it, Dublin to somewhere. And it was in the spring of the year, and it was a terrible, nasty day. And he took a stage. And he said he was right on top of the stage, and it was snowing and sleeting and was miserable. And finally Thomas said to him, Father, why don't you just buy a ticket and ride inside? And his father said, oh, no, that costs a lot more.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it tells you a little something when you have that attitude. But then, of course, William died right after the turn of the 20th century. He did have to become an American citizen. He did have a home in Washington. And, of course, his main home was in London, where he's buried. And then, of course, he had built the building here, 1896, which thankfully has all been restored in our downtown.
Yes.
And that was his office, and they lived upstairs. But then when he died, then Thomas got the Illinois land, the Missouri land, basically, Frederick got Kansas, Nebraska. And that story of Frederick and his family is Homer Sokolowski wrote that book about that side out there. And as I said, we got together one time in the old commercial hotel and should have had a tape recorder because there were a lot of things exchanged that we didn't think we could put in books, but at least at that time.
I want to tell an anecdote about Tom and his relationship to his community spirit. But before I do, I want to ask you a question. How long did it take you to write your thesis from the time you got the idea until you completed it, Paul?
About 4 years.
4 years in the making.
You know, the interesting thing about that, once I started it, then my professors at Illinois State, most of them have passed now except Dr. Plummer, who some of you see, he's been in Logan County a few times. He was a young professor and very helpful. But when they became much more interested, and they were pretty helpful about why don't you look up this and why don't you look up that, and you can't beat that type of help. But the day you have to take an oral exam the last day, and usually it's a nothing deal. You've got your thesis written, they've accepted it, and so usually your advisor and the second on the committee go down and they buy you a Pepsi-Cola and that's it. Mine, the department came. That was a little intimidating. Illinois State, what is this? And the head came and all of them, and then they all ask you questions. And I thought, but the one thing they said, and I think it's one of the reasons I didn't pursue it after that, Dr. Kinnaman, head of the department, said, it's too bad you didn't save this for your doctorate. And I just kind of turned me off for ever doing it after that. I'd done all that work. I could have gotten a doctorate on it later when they put the program in. In fact, when they put the doctorate program in at Illinois State, the young man from Chicago who did Chicago history and I were the first two candidates. And I did about half of it, but it just wasn't, if I stayed at Lincoln, they just didn't have that kind of pay for a doctorate, except for my friends got them, and they said, well, so I maybe should have, but I really got kind of turned off after that comment. It's too bad you did all this work and just got a master's. Yeah.
Judy and I have often talked here at Viewpoint about what a giving and caring community this entire county area is for their various philanthropies and so forth. We had an outstanding example last week with Bill Bates and Dave Gowitzer administering the Wood Foundation. But I remember very vividly a story of my family. My mother's uncle went to old Tom Scully on behalf of St. Clara's Hospital to seek some money for them. And old Tom said to Fred, it's my business to preserve it, not give it away. And he walked out of there without a penny. So that was kind of the attitude that was prevailing in that Scully family, with the notable exception of T.A. wife Violet Scully, who was about as gracious as a lady and as giving a lady as this community ever had.
Well, there is being a trustee at Lincoln College, like this one, and you may have heard me tell it, that David Hartz, when I was doing my thesis, people said, you need to go see David Hartz, who, of course, Hartz Hall.
Sure.
And what a wonderful man. I got to know him just at the end of his life. And he was on the Board of Trustees at Lincoln College with Tom Scully when things were really tough in the late 30s, I guess, and early 40s. And Mr. Hartz told me that they would be at a meeting and the president would say, well, we're really hard up against it. We've got to have $5,000 or $6,000 or whatever it would be to meet this bill.
Current bills.
And David said, Hartz said I'd get my checkbook out and I'd write my check out, and he'd say, come on, Tom, get your checkbook out right in front of everybody. And only a man of David Hart's stature could do that. He says, come on. He said, T.A. would grumble and grumble, but the checkbook came out, and he'd say, what are you writing yours for? Well, I'm writing for $3,000, and he'd write and then hand the president the two checks. So, but it took a man of Hart's stature, I think, to do that. I never knew T.A. As I said, when they asked him about doing it, he was very ill at the time. I worked with Michael, It was wonderful. I really miss Michael a lot. And he was always for going over to Ireland. Of course, for him, like, well, why don't you just take off school for a week and let's go? I said, why don't you go talk to the dean?
Yeah.
But he wanted to go over and check and see if his grandfather really had shot his boom brother and things like that. He was just that kind of a guy. So that's your family. You don't want to dig that up. I don't care. But they were so long ago. Remember, here's Peter Scully, whose grandfather, not great-grandfather, grandfather was William Scully.
Think of that.
1850s. And here's Peter, very much alive today. But they got the Illinois ground, and they had a tough time in the 30s. There were some problems, with things were tough in the 30s. They had to get their rents down to where people could survive. You didn't have mega farmers. You didn't have companies that owned 25, 30 tractors and all that. You didn't have any of that. So they had to make that work, but they always kept up their drainage. They built the dams, the purse dams. He loved those. Michael and Peter had to build those, rocks and gravel and wire, and just basically dam up some of those waterways up here, at least out here in Prairie Creek. The rotation, they kept that up. It wasn't just until modern times that they let them go to something else like corn and beans in Miami, as I always get them about. Corn, beans, and alfalfa or something. Just modern times have they gone to all row crop, all beans and corn. So
it's going to be able to keep going. Well, what I want to address is somebody's bell ring. What I want to address is Mrs. Scully and her commitment to the community. Many a time I've seen her on her hands and knees down there in that Elm Park, which is now where Neil Tire is, and certainly around the depot, doing her own work, not standing over watching somebody. She was down doing the work herself, making significant contributions to her community. I
think she was one of the really great women, and as you remember, Bill, when the Courier asked me to pick our 10 outstanding people in history, and I chickened out and said, not without some help. I went to Bill, and who do we have? Pete Franz and Britta Harris, I think.
That's
and so we picked some people, and Bill came up with the idea that number one would be our servicemen, which I think is a perfect choice. And we went to Mr. Handlin and others and Stringer. And we said, now we need to get some ladies. And almost instantly, all four people said, Mrs. Scully. Think of that. All the different generations all said Mrs. Scully. What a terrific lady. I got to know her. I rode one time to Chicago with her, and she sat there and told me about being a girl in Scotland in the heather, and it was just like painting a picture in front of you. But I remember this. You guys remember this. In the depot, there was a time when they tried to save it. They were going to, before it became a restaurant and all that, we had this move to save the original depot, the red, well, not the original one, but the red one where it is today. And there was a meeting, and I ended up sitting in the back, and Violet Scully came in and sat down. And they were talking about it, what they could do, and I turned to Mrs. Scully and I said, Miss Scully, I think if you'd go up and say something, it'd carry some weight. And she said, honest, the guy said, oh, I don't see how I could be of any help. I'm just a citizen like the rest of you. And I thought of George Orwell's Animal Farm, but some are more equal than others.
Yeah, right.
But to back it up, at the end of the meeting, said, well, she tapped me on the arm and said, would you do me a favor? Would you take this up for me? And she'd written a check, and I couldn't help but take a look at it, and I think it was like $50,000.
Look at that.
But she was just a citizen like the rest of us. But I mean, she had that attitude. That's why people loved her. She would do those things. Remember at the college, I had an adult program one night on the history of Logan County, and the third night was going to be the Scully Estates for adults. And I look out, and she's signing up. And this little girl's going to take her money, and I went running. I said, no, she
don't take her money.
So I talked on the Scullys that night, and I never will forget this. And I turned off the lights over there in the old University Hall, and then we did the downstairs classroom. And she tapped me on the arm. I didn't even see her, just tapped me. And she said, I want to thank you for being so kind to us. And then that's what Peter echoed that night in Elkhart. But because you could really dwell on it. The things over in Ireland were bad. I mean, shootings and beatings and taking people out of their homes, just absolutely taking them out of their homes with no place to go. He did that. Now here, I don't think, he wasn't here. He wasn't, his agents did all his work. He hired agents, like Jim Stewart and Jim Walden and people that I knew. And I think Herman Dammerman did it, and Kenley was his first The Germans did the German agents originally did the work. He wasn't out there one-on-one with them. I don't know about Tom. I heard he used to make the rounds in the 30s. Wasn't too sure he might get shot at.
Isn't it interesting that Mrs. Violet Scully was just a 180?
She's tremendous.
From her husband and
Well, look at the beautiful
father-in-law.
park we have.
Yeah, oh, my.
Beautiful.
Too.
Well, Paul, you've done a great service to the citizens of Logan County. Anybody that's been in Logan County any time at all, even newcomers, inevitably are going to hear in a hurry sometime along about the Scully Estates, and they don't know what the Scully Estates really entail. You have done a great job of bringing this together, and we appreciate the fact you spent some time with us this morning. I've been lucky enough to have family that knew the Scullys, and I knew Mrs. Scully quite well. I was privileged to do that. And so it's nice to review a family that has been so important in both a social and an economic way. This is a political season. Did you know that, Mrs. Busby? This is a political season?
Oh, no, I hadn't heard that.
Yeah, well, I think one of the candidates has found a new song for the year. I think one of the presidential candidates has probably adopted a song, and it says, "I'll be home before Christmas." So I think.
But did you know what William Scully thought about our government? You talk about not a nice guy. They asked him what he thought about democracy, who he was profiting by, obviously, and he said, "Oh, now the best form of government in the world is a king. If you got a good one, the only bad thing is you get a bad one. The bloody boogers live forever." So I mean, he had seen Lincoln and thought the only thing his thought was about Lincoln was, well, he was a very homely man.
Oh,
I mean, so we're not talking about.
I brought up politics because I found a great quote by a fellow that I respected very much, Senator Barry Goldwater, whose son appeared with us on Viewpoint, and that is, the cost of liberty is less than the cost of repression. Thank you very much for Viewpoint. Enjoy your day. Thank you, Paul.